Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome back to the NRW. I'm your host here, Rob Medina, and I thank you all very much for joining me here today because today I'm going to be reviewing the movie American History X. What's funny is that I did want to review this film for quite some time. In fact, around the beginning of the time I started to do reviews here at the NRW, I actually made a list of films that I want to review, and this is actually one of those movies that was on that list. I have since lost that list. I don't know where it's at to this day. But it's funny because I also had conversations with various people sporadically throughout the years since I started doing reviews here at the NRW, where this movie did come up, and for some reason, whether it be we were talking about Edward Norton or a movie that was dealing with subject matters that were very heavy. And whenever this movie had come up, I always remember I'm going to do a review for this film one day. So by chance, I was on YouTube, and I forgot what channel it was, but there was a channel that always posts up just a reminder for people, hey, this movie came out on this day back in 1995, however many years ago. So I always thought that was so interesting that I came across this movie the week of the film's release, because this movie came out back on October 30th, 1998. I was just like, pfft. So I saw this movie for the first time in 1999. In fact, my dad rented this movie. I don't remember if I saw it with him first. I do remember I saw it by myself. I may have seen it with him. I just don't remember the exact details. But when I saw the movie for the first time, I was just blown away, like how good the movie turned out. But what's also interesting too is that I do also remember specifically having conversations with one friend of mine at the time who I went to high school, middle school with. But this conversation took place in middle school, where he was pointing out that he was in Georgetown, and I can't exactly remember what he had done that caught the attention of these neo-Nazis in Georgetown, where they were going to confront about something. I guess he looked at them a certain way, and they were about to, push him around or something like that. And there happened to be a cop right there, and then the neo-Nazi guy said, "You're fucking lucky," and then walked away. And he was just like, I was fucking scared. And he was just a white guy too that's telling me this story. And I was just like, wait, there's neo-Nazis in this area? He's like, yeah, you didn't know that? And I was like, no, I did not. Because when I grew up in an area where it was very affluent with a bunch of people from all walks of life, from different religions, different backgrounds, Asians, blacks, Hispanics, people who were, Muslim, Christian, Catholics, Buddhists, among other things as well too. So it was really hard for me to grasp, especially at that time, that there were races of that sort in our area. And then that same friend that I had went to school with had also told me as well too some other stories that he personally had seen and dealt with, where he was like, yeah, there's a lot of racists in this area, believe it or not. I was like, you serious? He's like, yeah, you didn't realize that? I was like, no. He's like, because like I was telling him that I've seen racism, but it was always very sporadic and never really directed towards me. I've been in groups where I've hung out with a bunch of Hispanics, and I've seen someone who was white, even black guys too, that would shout some racial slur to us, and then we would just shout something back in return, and then that would be the extent of it. But never really had someone say something directly racist to me that I was deeply affected by. What's interesting too is that I don't mean to go off a tangent, but I'm just going to say this right now. The only time I actually really dealt with any sort of like prejudice or whatever the closest to racism is, was within my own community, which is very odd because I've seen some Hispanics that would be very racist towards other races, but within like Hispanic community, there's a lot of inner racism as well too that I remember specifically seeing growing up as a kid, and I saw that with other races as well too. I've seen that with Asians, I've seen it with other black people as well. So what's interesting is that that's what I grew up watching up close and personal within my community, and watching other communities as well too, with friends that I've had as well with those respective communities. And then when I was watching this movie, I never actually felt like I saw any of that growing up as far as white people being racist towards people of color. I actually never seen it to that extent. I've seen elements of that, but never that directly as far as I'm concerned. But when I was told through a friend of mine at the time that, yeah, that stuff exists, and they're in Georgetown, they're heavily surrounding Georgetown, they're here in the Northern Virginia area, you'd be very surprised how many racists are out here, KKKs, neo-Nazis. I was just blown away with that. So when I saw this movie, I remembered that conversation that I had with my friend. And when I saw the film, I also remember thinking, like, are they that violent? And then of course you hear various other stories about what has happened out there. So I'm going to point this out right now too, that I say what I said in the beginning of this review about my experiences with racism, because I want to point out something that I have no intention at all to point out any sort of political aspects or any sort of personal beliefs or anything of that sort. I'm going to talk about purely the merits of this film. I may delve into some personal aspects about what I felt about certain scenes and whatever the case may be, because in order for me to really delve into about this movie, I'm going to have to get into a lot of spoilers in this review. So if you have never seen the film, I do recommend you guys pause the video, check out the film, then come on back. And if you don't care, we'll continue on from there. But I will get into the plot synopsis, and I also get into my positives, my negatives, and then my rating. Living a life marked by violence, neo-Nazi Derek Vineyard finally goes to prison after killing 2 black youths. Upon his release, Derek vows to change. He hopes to prevent his brother Danny, who idolizes Derek, from following in his footsteps. And that right there is the film in a nutshell. So now let's get into my positives. My first positive with this movie actually has to do with Edward Norton, because Edward Norton to me is really what sells the film to its fullest potential. One thing that's interesting that I learned in preparation for this review is that I had read that the director Tony Kaye was very hesitant about wanting to cast Edward Norton after he was suggested, I think, by the producers or one of the casting directors, if I recall correctly, because he had wanted to have Joaquin Phoenix play the part of Derek Vineyard, but Joaquin had turned it down. So, other people had recommended, well, we should talk to Edward Norton. He'd be really good for the part. And he was like, he doesn't have the look that I'm needing for this character, because he felt like the character Derek definitely had to be someone who's very physically powerful looking, has this like presence about him, and he didn't feel like Edward had any of those elements as far as what was required for the character. Eventually, they worked out a deal to have Edward sign on to the part, but Edward did eventually put on a lot of muscle. I think he put on like 25 pounds worth of muscle, and it definitely shows on the screen. When you see him, surely you can definitely tell he worked out for the part. And I think it was wonderful that Edward committed to the role in that respect as far as the physical presence is concerned, because what's interesting is that with the character of Derek Vineyard, when you first get to learn about him early on in the movie, you get to see that he didn't start off that way as more or less as a racist, as someone who was very adamant about cleansing the area or the country, if you will, and making it purely white, where he felt that white people were not the problem. It was everyone else who were black, Hispanics, Asian, among other things as well, that were really the problem in this country. And when you get to see what that introduction of him very early in the film, and you're wondering where did this all come from, there's one scene in the movie that actually deals with him and his father. Well, it's actually a family dinner, really, where his father is asking him about his day, and Derek is telling, I have this teacher who's really intelligent. He's got 2 PhDs, and I don't know why he's even teaching at our little school, but he's really smart. He's very intelligent. He's got this presence about him and so on. Like, he's really impressed with this teacher that he has, who happens to be black. And when his father starts questioning further about this here, I could see what it was that Derek saw in his father, which is that his father just questioned everything. But when he questioned everything, he always come back with like, but you don't see these things. But let me tell you why you should see this, is because this, and this. And like, you could see that all the seeds were planted there very early on, at least in this particular case here with Derek at that dinner scene, where you could see the influence that his father had. But what's interesting is that it's an influence that he had from his father, but we get the impression there was never an abusive one at that. In fact, you definitely get to see that he's a very loving person, a man who's just working hard, doing the right thing, more or less, and despite his obscure views, but really was just looking out for the well-being of his family, himself, and just being more or less a good example. And that's something you could see that Derek really loved about his father. So when his father was killed his father was a firefighter. He was killed in a neighborhood that's a black community, and someone in the neighborhood had killed him. Clearly, that broke him, and you can clearly see that all that rage that he had developed from the death of his father, all the things that his father had planted inside his head about black people, Hispanics, and other races as well, too, not being up to standard with the white race. All that started to fester in there and just started to grow right then and there. You could see that grow right in front of you in that particular interview while he was being asked about what his thoughts about what had happened to his father. And then from there, that pretty much started the path for him in leading the DOC that is more or less being run by somebody else, played by the actor Stacy Keach, who's phenomenal in this movie too. So you get to see those bits and pieces of where it all had started, where you get the whole story more or less. And I think that because this film does a really good job of going back and forth between the current time and the past. And the past, you can tell it's the past when it's black and white, and the events that are occurring right now are all in color. I love that contrast between the two scenes there when it comes to the past and the present, because you get to see like where everything started to build up for Derek as the story progresses along the way. And in Edward Norton, I think a lot of people can agree that he's a really good actor, but a lot of people always go back to some of his earlier work as far as like how good of an actor he really is. And this is one of those films that come to the top of the list as far as people that remember like how great of an actor he really is. And you get to see that in various ways in this movie, where you get to see the emotional man that is breaking down after going through some hardships on more than one occasion throughout this film. And then the man that is developing the leadership skills of showing these guys that he's trying to lead here that this is what's wrong with this country, and I'm going to show you why. And he gives him, his version of evidence and backing it up with the numbers and the statistics and whatever else. And he's saying, and these are the people that are causing our problems. And this store was owned by this one guy who was great. He hired all you guys, and then when this Korean guy bought it out, he fired you guys, and then he hired illegal immigrants because they're cheaper in wages and so on and so forth. And instead of helping the country, they're breaking it down. So like he's pointing out like in their eyes, the obvious facts for them, and then having someone like, in this case, like Edward Norton, portraying that character in such a compelling way that you can see why people listen to him. You can see why people follow him, why people in many ways worship him too. So I think that Edward Norton really is what sells the film as far as what he's able to command on screen. And then when you see that deconstruction of his point of views as far as like what had changed for him along the way, and not having to more or less start all over, where you could tell that all these years of hatred that was building up, that eventually it was too much to carry. It was a burden for him. And then he wants to walk away, and he understands that his life is on the line in doing so. And he's understanding what needs to be done to get away from it all there, having to let go of a lot of relationships that he's developed throughout the years. So it's very interesting to see that aspect of the character's journey, which I think Edward Norton does a really good job in portraying here. Now, the other thing I also want to point out too with this film is the aspects of the racism in this film. Now, it's funny because I had seen a very short clip of Ethan Suplee, who plays the character of Seth in this movie. This is when Ethan Suplee was a lot heavy back in those days. He's lost a lot of the weight now. He's in great shape, maintains a really healthy lifestyle too. And he was asked about this film, and the guy that was talking to him saying, do you think this movie could be made today? He was like, right away, he said, no, it cannot. We cannot make this movie today. And when I heard him say that, I thought about that in this movie when I was watching the film, I had to say, where I was thinking about all the things that were occurring in this film. There's a scene in the movie where Derek is leading more or less his followers into a grocery store where they're employed with people of color, and some of them are legal. At least that's the impression he's giving off to a lot of these people who are following him. And it's a very hard scene to watch for me personally. There's really no violence as far as like someone's beating, there's no blood, there's no body parts being pulled apart, whatever. It's nothing like that. It's just the atmosphere and the emphasis of what they're trying to do, and conflict pain and embarrassment to all the people that are working at the store who are just doing an honest day's work and have no idea what the hell is going on, and they're surprised that they're caught up in this mess here. And then they're the ones left behind with all the pain and suffering that's going to follow through after that, depending on how they learn to deal with that along the way too. So when I was watching that scene, I was just like, can that scene work today? Can we make a scene of that sort today? And I probably would have to agree with Ethan that maybe we couldn't do that, and not in that way, not anymore. But what's also interesting too is that with the level of racism in this film, both Ethan Suplee and Edward Furlong have said on many interviews that they were very uncomfortable having to repeat those lines where they're saying it's a lot of racist stuff about the various people they come across in this film. And it was very hard for them to have to do that on a consistent basis for the role. But despite their hesitation, you can clearly see that they're very committed to the role for the purposes of the story, because there is a message that this film definitely is trying to get across here, which is clearly that racism and hatred is something that's taught, and it's just a burden to carry, which I do agree with, and I 100% agree with that, I should say. But there's always more to the story. And why I think this film works so well is because as much as people would want to point out that racism is wrong, and believe me, I know it's wrong and it is very wrong, but there's always a story about where this all began. And you get to see that in this movie, where along the way, where you see a man who was very violent, killed people of color, and was calling all sorts of names, you get to see that this man is changing. And I remember one time I came across, I think it was on MTV, where they had these ads that would run through with people that were talking about their backgrounds. And one of them was a white guy who was a former neo-Nazi. But he said that I have to wear, long sleeve shirts because my neck on down is covered in tattoos with nothing but white supremacy. And I cannot wear a t-shirt anymore because everyone's gonna see all the racist stuff that I have on my body, so I have to wear these long sleeve shirts. And there's a scene in the movie where Edward Norton, or sorry, I should say Derek Vineyard, played by Edward Norton, like after everything he's gone through, and clearly he's changed his views, and he's looking himself in the mirror after taking a shower, and he's putting his hand over his chest where he has this the swastika, and you can clearly tell, like, what the fuck did I just do? And like, it's one of those things where he believed it in so much that he wanted that to be a part of him. And now he's looking back and he's like, what the fuck did I just do? And, and you see that the character's changed, but the consequences of his past and the consequences of what he carries on him, people are going to look at him in various different ways, and whether they will be forgiving, it's going to be yet to be seen. Some people have forgiven, especially his principal, who was also his teacher at the time, that actually looked out for him while he was in prison as well too, visiting him and giving him some books to read and so on, and was very influential on him as well too. So it's interesting to see how the story of racism is told in this film, but you get to see where it all began for the character and how it starts to how it made him who he was, and then eventually what led him to want to walk away from it all. And you have to give a lot of credit to the supporting cast as well too. I mean, Edward Furlong, Ethan Suplee, Frusa Balk, I think is how I pronounce her name. She's phenomenal in the film. Beverly D'Angelo. I'm forgetting names off the top of my head here, but everyone in this movie, I think, does a really good job in effectively portraying the perspective that they're coming from. Because even Danny, Derek's brother, played by Edward Furlong, there are times where he points out that there are some people of color that are all right, and then Seth, played by Ethan Suplee, he's like, no, they're not. None of them are okay. Cameron, who's played by Stacey Keach, who's the overall leader of this thing, of the DOC, I should say, was like, Cameron says we should not even, if we don't know them, we don't want to get to know them. None of those people are up to standard. We're better than them. And Danny has some perspective, like, well, some of them are all right. And you can see that he's still holding on to some of the previous values he had before. And what's interesting is that, you get to see how certain people, maybe that are white, of course, that may still have that perspective despite being in an environment that are saying, no, that's not cool. We're not for that at all. And then force that change on them by threatening them, because that happens in the movie too, where Ethan's like, I'm gonna kick your fucking ass, and shit, saying all sorts of shit to Danny to tell him what I want to hear, which is say what I want to hear. And Danny's repeating this rhetoric about the white race is superior and so on and so forth. And like, I've seen stuff like that, not to that extent as far as like racism is concerned, but I've seen stuff like that where I've seen friends, family tell their other friends and family what they want them to tell them, what they want to hear from them, and then put them in that position where they're saying, say it the way I told you to. And that's something that is taught, and then you can see that they're being manipulated in a lot of ways as well too, because either they don't know any better or they're just too afraid to speak up. And in Danny's case, you get to see that Edward Furlong does a really good job in just saying that I worship my brother, I respect my brother, I idolize my brother, and I want to be like him. That's where that stems from for him. So whereas all the other characters, when you see Beverly D'Angelo, who is very conflicted with her son being an extreme racist person who is basically ruining the family's life, and how his set of values is nothing like how she is. And she's even gone as far as telling her son that I'm embarrassed to have you come out of my body. And that's pretty hard to hear, to have a son hear from their mother, especially if they love their mother very much. So like there's heavy consequences. And then you get to see where Edward Norton, in this case, Derek Vineyard, his character's like, all right, fine, I'm done. I'm gone. Like he's willing to detach himself from that because you don't see what I see. And because of that, I can't be with you. Like, he really is holding on to those values for himself and believing that's much more important than his family. All those events I've seen in this movie, I have experienced in some way, shape, or form, not necessarily in the racist way, but just how manipulated people can be and how other people let them manipulate it along the way as well too. So it's a very interesting character study along that you get to see how certain people are influenced, how they're influenced, and they're just looking for something to better themselves, to get out of this funk that they're in, and the promises that are made to them to be able to achieve bigger and better things, if you will. So it's very interesting to see that. One other thing I'm going to point out here too about this film that I think is a major positive for me is that you get to see that the very same people that, in this case, Derek has a very big problem with, in this case, people who are Black, Hispanics, and so on, are the very same people that have the most impact on him, the one that looked out for him the most. It wasn't the white guys that looked out for him. I mean, there was a white gang that he was associated with in the prison, but as soon as he told them, hey, you do know that we have these values, and you're not even holding up to those values. Who are you to tell? Who are you? Like, what exactly are you really doing? And they're like, listen, man, come on, we got to learn to play the game a little bit, so on and so. He's like, no, our values are like this, and they're telling him, listen, man, stop with this preaching bullshit, get over it, cool down on it, and everyone will get fine. And he just refused to let that go, and he paid the consequences. Now, the same guys that were on his side were the ones that pretty much turned his back on him as well too. And despite the fact raping him, they were like, hey, come and sit down with us. He's like, fuck all that nonsense. And then eventually, the one person that looked out for him, that protected him, turned out to be a Black guy that he befriended while he was in prison along the way too. And his teacher, who was a major influence over him, along with his father, who saw that Derek had lost his way, came back to go visit him and say, hey, I'm here to help. And you get to see that being rebuilt along the way as well too. So it's very interesting to see that the very same people that he had a major problem with were the ones that helped him out the most. So I always thought that was quite a beautiful aspect of the story that we got to see in this film, that did it in a way that was very, very authentic, that was very, very important, very meaningful. At the same time, not just doing it for the sake of doing. Like, there are lead-ups to that, there's a time for that, and there's a place for that, and it all served well for the overall narrative story. And then the way that the film ends as well too, I will point out here, for those who have not seen the film, I recommend you guys stop if you don't want to get spoiled here. But one of the things that Derek really wanted to get away from was the community, as far as the neo-Nazi community that he was involved with, that he helped create as well too. And we get to see that Danny, Derek's brother, is a bit of a troublemaker as well too. He's a bit of a pusher, a bit of an instigator, I should say. And then when he gets killed by a Black person, you wonder as the film ends, because you don't know what happens after the fact. You see that he's broken and he's obviously very destroyed by the loss of his brother, who's killed. And we know that he finds out that he was killed by a Black person. And you wonder, will he go right back to where he started again, from after losing his father and now losing his brother? What happens then? And we never know. We don't know the story of what happens to Derek after the film ends, and that's left for us to decide. Do we think that he's going to change? A part of me believes that he's not going to go back, but it would probably be a lot harder for him to this time around to resist, if you will, to have to go back to his old ways, if that makes any sense. And I think that's a wonderful way to end this film, because you get to see everything that he's gone through, and you also get to see the hardship he's gone through, the consequences from what he's been doing, and the various other people he's decided to separate from. And then what's going to occur after the fact? Are the very same people that were turning his back on him for him saying, I don't want to be with you anymore, are they going to come back to him and say, hey, by the way, we're going to take you in now, we're going to take care of you now? I mean, it's interesting to see how that would play out, but we never get to see that in this movie, which I think is a beautiful way to end the story for us as the audience to decide that here. So there's a lot about this movie that I can certainly point out what I really like about it here, but I think I'm just going to stop the pauses here on this note, and then I'll get into my negatives. The only real negative that I have with the film, and again, this isn't really a negative, it's more like I wanted more. It's just that there's a scene in the movie I mentioned before where you get to see Derek talk to his father. And his father, you can clearly see, is someone that Derek really loves and respects. I would have liked to seen a little bit more of that, because when you see that in the very beginning of the film, when Derek is talking to the news reporter asking about the death of his father, you can clearly see he's hurt by it. He's really just broken by that. And then you get to see the time that the little time that we do have with him and his father at the dinner scene. It's a very good one, but I actually wanted more out of that relationship, because I wanted to see what exactly did his father influence him from the very beginning, apart from the fact that we see that his father is clearly a racist. But I always wondered, did Derek always know that? Did he always know that his father was like that? Because to me, it almost seemed like that particular scene, like that's the first time he's gotten the impression that his father is a racist, but has a good point about the racism. So I always felt like there was something that was missing in that respect with the story, where we could have gotten a little bit more out of that here, because the movie sits around an hour, 40 some minutes long, or just under 2 hours, I should say. And I would have liked a little bit more time with the two characters, where you get to really see like how the influence of his father really molded him to the man that he was, because he's a very good kid. Like the fact that his father's racist, but his son is going to school and say, "Hey, this teacher of mine is fantastic." So really, and then he says, and he's black too, and like he's like, "Well, he's black. He's having you read these type of books and so on and so forth." He's like, "Yeah, and they're really good books. Like, why is having you read it?" "Well, I don't know. He says they're really good books." So he's like, "Well, no, I don't agree with that at all." So like, I wanted more of that, because when you get to the time to see how the relationship was between Derek and the principal that oversees the school that Danny goes to and Derek used to go to as well, you understand where that relationship stems from, and you understand that the time they had together, and they have various scenes together, it makes a lot of sense, because you have the history and you have the exposition, but you also have the continuation, if you will. I think that does a really good job fleshing out that aspect of the story, which I would have liked to see more of with Derek and his father. So for me, that's really the only major negative of the film that I really have here. I mean, there are some little minor stuff, but it's really, for me, there's really no point of me bringing it up here. But it's overall, I would say that despite the negatives despite the one negative I have of the film, this movie, in my opinion, is damn near perfect. In my opinion, because there's a lot of great qualities this movie does have in terms of storytelling, in terms of character development, and the time and the pacing you have to be able to see how the story begins, how it unfolds, and goes back and forth, and yet never feels too convoluted, out of place, never felt a little uneven. Is always consistent all across the board. It's a very hard thing to accomplish, and I think this movie does a really good job in accomplishing that here. So for me, that's actually be the end of my negatives. Now let's get into my rating. Well, it's no secret that I do love this film. I think this movie really, to me, is really damn near perfect. And although there's a lot of critiques out there about the subject matter that this film does deal with here, and I understand those critiques, but I truly do understand the purpose of the story, because I am not going to say that we need another film of this sort, because I don't think we really do. Because this movie, in my opinion, I think does a really good job in showcasing a perspective of someone's point of view of why they believe what they believe in. And there are a lot of exposition and a lot of conversations that occur in the film of events that are very relevant today. So in a lot of ways, this movie does have a very timeless element to it, where you can probably watch this movie in the 70s and you probably will still have the same effect. Watch in the 80s and it will probably still have the same effect. Even watch it today, I believe it still has the same effect as well too. So there's a wonderful timeless element that I think this movie does have. I know this movie is not going to be for everybody, but I do believe this is a very strong film with great actors, great performances, and I still think it holds up well to this day. Even after the first time I saw this movie, it still holds up very, very strong. So for me, I give this movie a solid cheers. And those are my thoughts on the film. Now, if you have seen this movie, let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to the NRW. Make sure you guys hit the notification bell while you're down there as well, too. And also follow NRW on social media. On Instagram, New Release Wednesdays. On Facebook, Nerds Rule the World. And on Twitter, @the_NRW. You can follow me on my social media accounts. On Instagram, You're So Cool with Rob Medina. On Twitter, You're So Cool with WRM. And on Facebook, simply just Rob Medina. And that'll be it, guys. I hope you guys enjoy this review. Until next time, stay safe out there and cheers.